There came the sound of boys scuttling away. Astonishingly, a dark figure moved against the tide. Roger? Yes. Well, that's 3, then. Once more they set out to climb the slope of the mountain. The darkness seemed to flow round them like a tide. Jack, who said nothing, began to choke and cough, and a gust of wind set all 3 spluttering. Ralph's eyes were blinded with tears. Ashes. We're on the edge of the burnt patch. Their footsteps and the occasional breeze were stirring up small devils of dust. Now that they stopped again, Ralph had time, while he coughed, to remember how silly they were. If there was no beast, and almost certainly there was no beast, in that case, well and good. But if there was something waiting on top of the mountain, what was the use of 3 of them, handicapped by the darkness, and carrying only sticks? We're being fools. Out of the darkness came the answer. Windy? Irritably, Ralph shook himself. This was all Jack's fault. Course I am, but we're still being fools. If you don't want to go on, said the voice sarcastically, I'll go up by myself. Ralph heard the mockery and hated Jack. The sting of ashes in his eyes, tiredness, fear, enraged him. Go on, then. We'll wait here. There was silence. Why don't you go? Are you frightened? A stain in the darkness, a stain that was Jack, detached itself and began to draw away. All right. So long. The stain vanished. Another took its place. Ralph felt his knee against something hard and rocked a charred trunk that was edgy to the touch. He felt the sharp cinders that had been bark push against the back of his knee, and knew that Roger had sat down. He felt with his hands, and lowered himself beside Roger, while the trunk rocked among invisible ashes. Roger, uncommunicative by nature, said nothing. He offered no opinion on the beast, nor told Ralph why he had chosen to come on this mad expedition. He simply sat and rocked the trunk gently. Ralph noticed a rapid and infuriating tapping noise, and realized that Roger was banging his silly wooden stick against something. So they sat, the rocking, tapping, impervious Roger, and Ralph fuming. Round them the close sky was loaded with stars, save where the mountain punched up a hole of blackness. There was a slithering noise high above them, the sound of someone taking giant and dangerous strides on rock or ash. Then Jack found them, and was shivering and croaking in a voice they could just recognize as his. I saw a thing on top. They heard him blunder against the trunk, which rocked violently. He lay silent for a moment, then muttered, Keep a good lookout. It may be following. A shower of ash pattered round them. Jack sat up. I saw a thing bulge on the mountain. You only imagined it, said Ralph shakily, because nothing would bulge, not any sort of creature. Roger spoke. They jumped, for they'd forgotten him. A frog. Jack giggled and shuddered. Some frog. There was a noise, too, a kind of plop noise. Then the thing bulged. Ralph surprised himself not so much by the quality of his voice, which was even, but by the bravado of its intention. We'll go and look. For the first time since he had known Jack, Ralph could feel him hesitate. Now? His voice spoke for him, of course. He got off the trunk and led the way across the clinking cinders up into the dark, and the others followed. Now that his physical voice was silent, the inner voice of reason, and other voices too, made themselves heard. Piggy was calling him a kid. Another voice told him not to be a fool, and the darkness and desperate enterprise gave the night a kind of dentist's chair unreality. As they came to the last slope, Jack and Roger drew near, changed from ink stains to distinguishable figures. By common consent they stopped and crouched together. Behind them, on the horizon, was a patch of lighter sky where in a moment the moon would rise. The wind roared once in the forest and pushed their rags against them. Ralph stirred. "Come on." They crept forward, Roger lagging a little. Jack and Ralph turned the shoulder of the mountain together. The glittering lengths of the lagoon lay below them, and beyond that a long white smudge that was the reef. Roger joined them. Jack whispered, "Let's creep forward, on hands and knees. Maybe it's asleep." Roger and Ralph moved on, this time leaving Jack in the rear for all his brave words. They came to the flat top where the rock was hard to hands and knees. A creature that bulged. Ralph put his hand in the cold, soft ashes of the fire and smothered a cry. His hand and shoulder were twitching from the unlooked-for contact. Green lights of nausea appeared for a moment and ate into the darkness. Roger lay behind him, and Jack's mouth was at his ear. "Over there, where there used to be a gap in the rock. A sort of hump. See?" Ashes blew into Ralph's face from the dead fire. He could not see the gap or anything else because the green lights were opening again and growing, and the top of the mountain was sliding sideways. Once more, from a distance, he heard Jack's whisper, "Scared?" Not scared so much as paralyzed, hung up here, immovable on the top of the diminishing, moving mountain. Jack slid away from him. Roger bumped, fumbled with a hiss of breath, and passed onwards. He heard them whispering, "Can you see anything?" "There!" In front of them, only 3 or 4 yards away, was a rock-like hump where no rock should be. Ralph could hear a tiny chattering noise coming from somewhere, perhaps from his own mouth. He bound himself together with his will, fused his fear and loathing into a hatred, and stood up. He took 2 leaden steps forward. Behind them, the sliver of moon had drawn clear of the horizon. Before them, something like a great ape was sitting asleep, with its head between its knees. Then the wind roared in the forest. There was confusion in the darkness, and the creature lifted its head, holding towards them the ruin of a face. Ralph found himself taking giant strides among the ashes, heard other creatures crying out and leaping, and dared the impossible on the dark slope. Presently the mountain was deserted, save for the 3 abandoned sticks, and the thing that bowed. Chapter 8. Gift for the Darkness. Piggy looked up miserably from the dawn-pale beach to the dark mountain. "Are you sure? Really sure, I mean?" "I told you a dozen times now," said Ralph. "We saw it." "Do you think we're safe down here?" "How the hell should I know?" Ralph jerked away from him and walked a few paces along the beach. Jack was kneeling and drawing a circular pattern in the sand with his forefinger. Piggy's voice came to them, hushed. "Are you sure? Really?" "Go up and see," said Jack contemptuously, "and good riddance. No fear." "The beast had teeth," said Ralph, "and big black eyes." He shuddered violently. Piggy took off his 1 round of glass and polished the surface. "What are we going to do?" Ralph turned towards the platform. The conch glimmered among the trees, a white blob against the place where the sun would rise. He pushed back his mop. "I don't know." He remembered the panic flight down the mountainside. "I don't think we'd ever fight a thing that size, honestly. You know, we'd talk, but we wouldn't fight a tiger. We'd hide. Even Jack'd hide." Jack still looked at the sand. "What about my hunters?" Simon came stealing out of the shadows by the shelters. Ralph ignored Jack's question. He pointed to the touch of yellow above the sea. "As long as there's light, we're brave enough. But then, and now that thing squats by the fire as though it didn't want us to be rescued." He was twisting his hands now, unconsciously. His voice rose. "So we can't have a signal fire. We're beaten." A point of gold appeared above the sea, and at once all the sky lightened. "What about my hunters?" "Boys armed with sticks." Jack got to his feet. His face was red as he marched away. Piggy put on his one glass and looked at Ralph. "Now you've done it, you've been rude about his hunters." "Oh, shut up!" The sound of the inexpertly blown conch interrupted them. As though he was serenading the rising sun, Jack went on blowing till the shelters were astir, and the hunters crept to the platform, and the little uns whimpered as now they so frequently did. Ralph rose obediently, and Piggy, and they went to the platform. "Talk," said Ralph bitterly. "Talk, talk, talk." He took the conch from Jack. "This meeting—" Jack interrupted him. "I called it. If you hadn't called it, I should have. You just blew the conch." "Well, isn't that?" "Oh, take it. Go on, talk." Ralph thrust the conch into Jack's arms and sat down on the trunk. "I've called an assembly," said Jack, "because of a lot of things. First, you know now, we've seen the beast. We crawled up. We were only a few feet away. The beast sat up and looked at us. I don't know what it does. We don't even know what it is. The beast comes out of the sea, out of the dark. Trees—" "Quiet!" shouted Jack. "You listen. The beast is sitting up there, whatever it is. Perhaps it's waiting. Hunting. Yes, hunting, hunting," said Jack. He remembered his age-old tremors in the forest. "Yes, the beast is a hunter. Only shut up. The next thing is that we couldn't kill it. And the next thing is that Ralph said my hunters are no good." "I never said that." "I've got the conch. Ralph thinks you're cowards running away from the boar and the beast. And that's not all." There was a kind of sigh on the platform, as if everyone knew what was coming. Jack's voice went on, tremulous yet determined, pushing against the uncooperative silence. "He's like Piggy. He says things like Piggy. He isn't a proper chief." Jack clutched the conch to him. "He's a coward himself." For a moment he paused, and then went on. "On top, when Roger and me went on, he stayed back. I went too. After." The two boys glared at each other through screens of hair. "I went on too," said Ralph. "Then I ran away. So did you." "Call me a coward, then." Jack turned to the hunters. "He's not a hunter. He'd never have got us meat. He isn't a prefect, and we don't know anything about him. He just gives orders and expects people to obey for nothing." "All this talk, shouted Ralph. "Talk, talk! Who wanted it? Who called the meeting?" Jack turned, red in the face, his chin sunk back. He glowered up under his eyebrows. "All right, then," he said, in tones of deep meaning and menace. "All right." He held the conch against his chest with one hand, and stabbed the air with his index finger. "Who thinks Ralph oughtn't to be chief?" He looked expectantly at the boys ranged round, who had frozen. Under the palms there was deadly silence. "Hands up," said Jack strongly. "Whoever wants Ralph not to be chief." The silence continued, breathless and heavy, and full of shame. Slowly the red drained from Jack's cheeks, then came back with a painful rush. He licked his lips and turned his head at an angle, so that his gaze avoided the embarrassment of linking with another's eye. "How many think—" His voice tailed off. The hands that held the conch shook. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly. "All right, then." He laid the conch with great care in the grass at his feet. The humiliating tears were running from the corner of each eye. "I'm not going to play any longer. Not with you." Most of the boys were looking down now, at the grass or their feet. Jack cleared his throat again. I'm not going to be part of Ralph's lot. He looked along the right-hand logs, numbering the hunters that had been a choir. I'm going off by myself. He can catch his own pigs. Anyone who wants to hunt when I do can come too. He blundered out of the triangle towards the drop to the white sand. Jack! Jack turned and looked back at Ralph. For a moment he paused, and then cried out, high-pitched, enraged, "No!" He leapt down from the platform and ran along the beach, paying no heed to the steady fall of his tears, and until he dived into the forest, Ralph watched him. Piggy was indignant. "I've been talking, Ralph, and you just stood there like—" Softly, looking at Piggy and not seeing him, Ralph spoke to himself. He'll come back. When the sun goes down, he'll come. He looked at the conch in Piggy's hand. What? Well, there. Piggy gave up the attempt to rebuke Ralph. He polished his glass again, and went back to his subject. We can do without Jack Merridew. There's others besides him on this island, but now we really got a beast, though I can't hardly believe it, we'll need to stay close to the platform. There'll be less need of him and his hunting, so now we can really decide on what's what. There's no help, Piggy. Nothing to be done. For a while they sat in depressed silence. Then Simon stood up and took the conch from Piggy, who was so astonished that he remained on his feet. Ralph looked up at Simon. Simon? What is it this time? A half-sound of jeering ran round the circle, and Simon shrank from it. I thought there might be something to do. Something we... Again the pressure of the assembly took his voice away. He sought for help and sympathy, and chose Piggy. He turned half towards him, clutching the conch to his brown chest. I think we ought to climb the mountain. The circle shivered with dread. Simon broke off and turned to Piggy, who was looking at him with an expression of derisive incomprehension. What's the good of climbing up to this here beast when Ralph and the other two couldn't do nothing? Simon whispered his answer. What else is there to do? His speech made, he allowed Piggy to lift the conch out of his hands. Then he retired and sat as far away from the others as possible. Piggy was speaking now with more assurance, and with what, if the circumstances had not been so serious, the others would have recognized as pleasure. I said we could all do without a certain person. Now I say we got to decide on what can be done, and I think I could tell you what Ralph's going to say next. The most important thing on the island is the smoke, and you can't have no smoke without a fire. Ralph made a restless movement. No go, Piggy, we've got no fire. That thing sits up there. We'll have to stay here. Piggy lifted the conch as though to add power to his next words. We got no fire on the mountain. But what's wrong with a fire down here? A fire could be built on them rocks, on the sand even. We'd make smoke just the same. That's right, smoke by the bathing pool. The boys began to babble. Only Piggy could have the intellectual daring to suggest moving the fire from the mountain. So we'll have the fire down here, said Ralph. He looked about him. We can build it just here between the bathing pool and the platform. Of course, he broke off, frowning, thinking the thing out, unconsciously tugging at the stub of a nail with his teeth. Of course, the smoke won't show so much, not be seen so far away. But we needn't go near the... The others nodded in perfect comprehension. There would be no need to go near. We'll build the fire now. The greatest ideas are the simplest. Now there was something to be done, they worked with passion. Piggy was so full of delight and expanding liberty in Jack's departure, so full of pride in his contribution to the good of society, that he helped to fetch wood. The wood he fetched was close at hand, a fallen tree on the platform that they did not need for the assembly. Yet to the others the sanctity of the platform had protected even what was useless there. Then the twins realized they would have a fire near them as a comfort in the night, and this set a few little uns dancing and clapping hands. The wood was not so dry as the fuel they had used on the mountain. Much of it was damply rotten and full of insects that scurried. Logs had to be lifted from the soil with care, or they crumbled into sodden powder. More than this, in order to avoid going deep into the forest, the boys worked near at hand on any fallen wood, no matter how tangled with new growth. The skirts of the forest and the scar were familiar, near the conch and the shelters, and sufficiently friendly in daylight. What they might become in darkness nobody cared to think. They worked, therefore, with great energy and cheerfulness, though as time crept by, there was a suggestion of panic in the energy and hysteria in the cheerfulness. They built a pyramid of leaves and twigs, branches and logs on the bare sand by the platform. For the first time on the island, Piggy himself removed his one glass, knelt down, and focused the sun on tinder. Soon there was a ceiling of smoke and a bush of yellow flame. The little uns, who had seen few fires since the first catastrophe, became wildly excited. They danced and sang, and there was a partyish air about the gathering. At last Ralph stopped work and stood up, smudging the sweat from his face with a dirty forearm. "We'll have to have a small fire. This one's too big to keep up." Piggy sat down carefully on the sand and began to polish his glass. "We could experiment. We could find out how to make a small hot fire and then put green branches on to make smoke. Some of them leaves must be better for that than the others." As the fire died down, so did the excitement. The little uns stopped singing and dancing and drifted away towards the sea or the fruit trees or the shelters. Ralph flopped down in the sand. "We'll have to make a new list of who's to look after the fire." "If you can find 'em." He looked round. Then, for the first time, he saw how few big uns there were, and understood why the work had been so hard. "Where's Morris?" Piggy wiped his glass again. "I expect— No, he wouldn't go into the forest by himself, would he?" Ralph jumped up, ran swiftly round the fire, and stood by Piggy, holding up his hair. "But we've got to have a list. That's you and me and Sam Nerrick and—" He would not look at Piggy, but spoke casually. "Where's Bill and Roger?" Piggy leaned forward and put a fragment of wood on the fire. "I expect they've gone. I expect they won't play either." Ralph sat down and began to poke little holes in the sand. He was surprised to see that one had a drop of blood on it. He examined his bitten nail closely, and watched the little globe of blood that gathered where the quick was gnawed away. Piggy went on speaking. "I seen 'em stealing off when we was gathering wood. They went that way, the same way as he went himself." Ralph finished his inspection and looked up into the air. The sky, as if in sympathy with the great changes among them, was different today, and so misty that in some places the hot air seemed white. The disk of the sun was dull silver, as though it was nearer and not so hot, yet the air stifled. "They always been making trouble, haven't they?" The voice came near his shoulder and sounded anxious. "We can do without 'em. We'll be happier now, won't we?" Ralph sat. The twins came, dragging a great log and grinning in their triumph. They dumped the log among the embers, so that sparks flew. "We can do all right on our own, can't we?" For a long time, while the log dried, caught fire, and turned red-hot, Ralph sat in the sand and said nothing. He did not see Piggy go to the twins and whisper with them, nor how the three boys went into the forest. "Here you are." He came to himself with a jolt. Piggy and the other two were by him. They were laden with fruit. "I thought perhaps," said Piggy, "we ought to have a feast, kind of." The three boys sat down. They had a great mass of fruit with them, and all of it properly ripe. They grinned at Ralph as he took some and began to eat. "Thanks," he said. Then, with an accent of pleased surprise, "Thanks."
"Do all right on our own," said Piggy. "It's them that haven't no common sense that make trouble on this island. We'll make a little hot fire."
Ralph remembered what had been worrying him. "Where's Simon?"
"I don't know."
"You don't think he's climbing the mountain?" Piggy broke into noisy laughter and took more fruit.
"He might be."
He gulped his mouthful.
"He's cracked."
Simon had passed through the area of fruit trees, but today the little uns had been too busy with the fire on the beach, and they had not pursued him there. He went on among the creepers until he reached the great mat that was woven by the open space, and crawled inside. Beyond the screen of leaves the sunlight pelted down, and the butterflies danced in the middle, their unending dance. He knelt down, and the arrow of the sun fell on him. The other time the air had seemed to vibrate with heat, but now it threatened. Soon the sweat was running from his long, coarse hair. He shifted restlessly, but there was no avoiding the sun. Presently he was thirsty, and then very thirsty. He continued to sit. Far off along the beach, Jack was standing before a small group of boys. He was looking brilliantly happy.
"Hunting,"
he said. He sized them up. Each of them wore the remains of a black cap, and ages ago they had stood in 2 demure rows, and their voices had been the song of angels.
"We'll hunt. I'm going to be chief."
They nodded, and the crisis passed easily.
"And then, about the beast."
They moved, looked at the forest.
"I say this. We aren't going to bother about the beast."
He nodded at them.
"We're going to forget the beast."
"That's right.
Yes, forget the beast."
If Jack was astonished by their fervour, he did not show it.
"And another thing, we shan't dream so much down here. This is near the end of the island."
They agreed passionately out of the depths of their tormented private lives.
"Now listen. We might go later to the Castle Rock, but now I'm going to get more of the big uns away from the conch and all that. We'll kill a pig and give a feast."
He paused and went on more slowly.
"And about the beast. When we kill, we'll leave some of the kill for it. Then it won't bother us, maybe."
He stood up abruptly.
"We'll go into the forest now and hunt."
He turned and trotted away, and after a moment they followed him obediently. They spread out nervously in the forest. Almost at once Jack found the dug and scattered roots that told of pig, and soon the track was fresh. Jack signalled the rest of the hunt to be quiet, and went forward by himself. He was happy, and wore the damp darkness of the forest like his old clothes. He crept down a slope to rocks and scattered trees by the sea. The pigs lay, bloated bags of fat, sensuously enjoying the shadows under the trees. There was no wind, and they were unsuspicious, and practice had made Jack silent as the shadows. He stole away again, and instructed his hidden hunters. Presently they all began to inch forward, sweating in the silence and heat. Under the trees an ear flapped idly. A little apart from the rest, sunk in deep maternal bliss, lay the largest sow of the lot. She was black and pink, and the great bladder of her belly was fringed with a row of piglets that slept or burrowed and squeaked. 15 yards from the drove, Jack stopped, and his arm, straightening, pointed at the sow. He looked round in inquiry to make sure that everyone understood, and the other boys nodded at him. The row of right arms slid back.
"Now!" The drove of pigs started up, and at a range of only 10 yards the wooden spears with fire-hardened points flew towards the chosen pig.
One piglet, with a demented shriek, rushed into the sea, trailing Roger's spear behind it. The sow gave a gasping squeal and staggered up with 2 spears sticking in her fat flank. The boys shouted and rushed forward, the piglets scattered, and the sow burst the advancing line and went crashing away through the forest. "After her!" They raced along the pig track, but the forest was too dark and tangled, so that Jack, cursing, stopped them and cast among the trees. Then he said nothing for a long time, but breathed fiercely, so that they were awed by him, and looked at each other in uneasy admiration. Presently he stabbed down at the ground with his finger. "There!" Before the others could examine the drop of blood, Jack had swerved off, judging a trace, touching a bough that gave. So he followed, mysteriously right and assured, and the hunters trod behind him. He stopped before a covert. "In there!" They surrounded the covert, but the sow got away with the sting of another spear in her flank. The trailing butts hindered her, and the sharp cross-cut points were a torment. She blundered into a tree, forcing a spear still deeper, and after that any of the hunters could follow her easily by the drops of vivid blood. The afternoon wore on, hazy and dreadful with damp heat. The sow staggered her way ahead of them, bleeding and mad, and the hunters followed, wedded to her in lust, excited by the long chase and the dropped blood. They could see her now, nearly got up with her, but she spurted with her last strength and held ahead of them again. They were just behind her when she staggered into an open space where bright flowers grew and butterflies danced round each other, and the air was hot and still. Here, struck down by the heat, the sow fell, and the hunters hurled themselves at her. This dreadful eruption from an unknown world made her frantic. She squealed and bucked, and the air was full of sweat and noise and blood and terror. Roger ran round the heap, prodding with his spear whenever pig-flesh appeared. Jack was on top of the sow, stabbing downward with his knife. Roger found a lodgment for his point and began to push till he was leaning with his whole weight. The spear moved forward inch by inch, and the terrified squealing became a high-pitched scream. Then Jack found the throat, and the hot blood spouted over his hands. The sow collapsed under them, and they were heavy and fulfilled upon her. The butterflies still danced, preoccupied in the centre of the clearing. At last the immediacy of the kill subsided. The boys drew back, and Jack stood up, holding out his hands. "Look!" He giggled and flicked them, while the boys laughed at his reeking palms. Then Jack grabbed Morris and rubbed the stuff over his cheeks. Roger began to withdraw his spear, and the boys noticed it for the first time. Robert stabilized the thing in a phrase which was received uproariously. "Right up her ass! Did you hear? Did you hear what he said? Right up her ass!" This time Robert and Morris acted the 2 parts, and Morris's acting of the pig's efforts to avoid the advancing spear was so funny that the boys cried with laughter. At length even this palled. Jack began to clean his bloody hands on the rock. Then he started work on the sow, and paunched her, lugging out the hot bags of coloured guts, pushing them into a pile on the rock, while the others watched him. He talked as he worked. "We'll take the meat along the beach. I'll go back to the platform and invite them to a feast. That should give us time." Roger spoke. "Chief." "How can we make a fire?" Jack squatted back and frowned at the pig. "We'll raid them and take fire. There must be 4 of you, Henry and you, Bill and Morris. We'll put on paint and sneak up. Roger can snatch a branch while I say what I want. The rest of you can get this back to where we were. We'll build the fire there. And after that—" He paused and stood up, looking at the shadows under the trees. His voice was lower when he spoke again. "But we'll leave part of the kill for—" He knelt down again and was busy with his knife. The boys crowded round him. He spoke over his shoulder to Roger. "Sharpen a stick at both ends." Presently he stood up, holding the dripping sow's head in his hands. "Where's that stick?" "Here." "Ram one end in the earth. Oh, it's rock. Jam it in that crack. There." Jack held up the head and jammed the soft throat down on the pointed end of the stick, which pierced through into the mouth. He stood back, and the head hung there, a little blood dribbling down the stick. Instinctively the boys drew back too, and the forest was very still. They listened, and the loudest noise was the buzzing of flies over the spilled guts. Jack spoke in a whisper. "Pick up the pig." Morris and Robert skewered the carcass, lifted the dead weight, and stood ready. In the silence, and standing over the dry blood, they looked suddenly furtive. Jack spoke loudly. "This head is for the beast. It's a gift." The silence accepted the gift and awed them. The head remained there, dim-eyed, grinning faintly, blood blackening between the teeth. All at once they were running away, as fast as they could, through the forest, towards the open beach. End of Disc 4. Lord of the Flies, Disc 5. Simon stayed where he was, a small brown image, concealed by the leaves. Even if he shut his eyes, the sow's head still remained like an after-image. The half-shut eyes were dim with the infinite cynicism of adult life. They assured Simon that everything was a bad business. "I know that." Simon discovered that he had spoken aloud. He opened his eyes quickly, and there was the head grinning amusedly in the strange daylight, ignoring the flies, the spilled guts, even ignoring the indignity of being spiked on a stick. He looked away, licking his dry lips. A gift for the beast. Might not the beast come for it? The head, he thought, appeared to agree with him. "Run away," said the head silently. "Go back to the others." It was a joke, really. Why should you bother? You were just wrong, that's all. A little headache, something you ate, perhaps. "Go back, child," said the head, silently. Simon looked up, feeling the weight of his wet hair, and gazed at the sky. Up there, for once, were clouds, great bulging towers that sprouted away over the island, grey and cream and copper-coloured. The clouds were sitting on the land. They squeezed, produced, moment by moment, this close, tormenting heat. Even the butterflies deserted the open space where the obscene thing grinned and dripped. Simon lowered his head, carefully keeping his eyes shut, then sheltered them with his hand. There were no shadows under the trees, but everywhere a pearly stillness, so that what was real seemed elusive and without definition. The pile of guts was a black blob of flies that buzzed like a saw. After a while these flies found Simon. Gorged, they alighted by his runnels of sweat, and drank. They tickled under his nostrils, and played leapfrog on his thighs. They were black and iridescent green, and without number. And in front of Simon, the Lord of the Flies hung on his stick, and grinned. At last Simon gave up, and looked back, saw the white teeth and dim eyes, the blood, and his gaze was held by that ancient, inescapable recognition. In Simon's right temple a pulse began to beat on the brain. Ralph and Piggy lay in the sand, gazing at the fire and idly flicking pebbles into its smokeless heart.
"That branch is gone."
"Where's Sam Nerrick?"
"We ought to get some more wood. We're out of green branches."
Ralph sighed and stood up. There were no shadows under the palms on the platform, only this strange light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. High up among the bulging clouds, thunder went off like a gun.
"We're going to get buckets of rain." "What about the fire?"
Ralph trotted into the forest and returned with a wide spray of green, which he dumped on the fire. The branch crackled, the leaves curled, and the yellow smoke expanded. Piggy made an aimless little pattern in the sand with his fingers.
"Trouble is, we haven't got enough people for a fire. You've got to treat Sam and Eric as one turn. They do everything together."
"Of course."
"Well, that isn't fair, don't you see? They ought to do 2 turns.
Ralph considered this and understood. He was vexed to find how little he thought like a grown-up, and sighed again. The island was getting worse and worse. Piggy looked at the fire.
"You'll want another green branch soon."
Ralph rolled over. "Piggy, what are we going to do?"
"Just have to get on without 'em."
"But the fire—" He frowned at the black and white mess in which lay the unburned ends of branches. He tried to formulate. "I'm scared." He saw Piggy look up and blundered on. "Not of the beast. I mean, I'm scared of that too, but nobody understands about the fire. If someone threw you a rope when you were drowning, if a doctor said, 'Take this because if you don't take it you'll die,' you would, wouldn't you? I mean—"
"Course I would."
"Can't they see? Can't they understand? Without the smoke signal we'll die here. Look at that." A wave of heated air trembled above the ashes, but without a trace of smoke. "We can't keep one fire going, and they don't care. And what's more—" He looked intensely into Piggy's streaming face. "What's more, I don't sometimes. Supposing I got like the others, not caring, what had become of us?" Piggy took off his glasses, deeply troubled.
"I don't know, Ralph. We just got to go on, that's all. That's what grown-ups would do."
Ralph, having begun the business of unburdening himself, continued. "Piggy, what's wrong?" Piggy looked at him in astonishment.
"Do you mean the—"
"No, not it. I mean, what makes things break up like they do?" Piggy rubbed his glasses slowly and thought. When he understood how far Ralph had gone towards accepting him, he flushed pinkly with pride.
"I don't know, Ralph. I expect it's him."
"Jack?"
"Jack."
A taboo was evolving round that word, too. Ralph nodded solemnly. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it must be." The forest near them burst into uproar. Demoniac figures with faces of white and red and green rushed out howling, so that the little ones fled screaming. Out of the corner of his eye Ralph saw Piggy running. 2 figures rushed at the fire, and he prepared to defend himself, but they grabbed half-burnt branches and raced away along the beach. The 3 others stood still, watching Ralph, and he saw that the tallest of them, stark naked save for paint and a belt, was Jack. Ralph had his breath back and spoke. "Well?" Jack ignored him, lifted his spear, and began to shout.
"Listen, all of you. Me and my hunters, we're living along the beach by a flat rock. We hunt and feast and have fun. If you want to join my tribe, come and see us. Perhaps I'll let you join. Perhaps not."
He paused and looked round. He was safe from shame or self-consciousness behind the mask of his paint, and could look at each of them in turn. Ralph was kneeling by the remains of the fire like a sprinter at his mark, and his face was half hidden by hair and smut. Sam Nerrick peered together round a palm tree at the edge of the forest. A little 'un howled, creased and crimson by the bathing pool, and Piggy stood on the platform, the white conch gripped in his hands.
"Tonight we're having a feast. We've killed a pig and we've got meat. You can come and eat with us if you like."
Up in the cloud canyons the thunder boomed again. Jack and the two anonymous savages with him swayed, looked up, and then recovered. The little 'un went on howling. Jack was waiting for something. He whispered urgently to the others, "Go on, now." The two savages murmured. Jack spoke sharply, "Go on." The two savages looked at each other, raised their spears, and spoke in time. "The chief has spoken." Then the three of them turned and trotted away. Presently Ralph rose to his feet, looking at the place where the savages had vanished. Sam Nerrick came, talking in an awed whisper. "I thought it was, and I was scared." Piggy stood above them on the platform, still holding the conch. "That was Jack and Morris and Robert," said Ralph. "Aren't they having fun?"
"I thought I was going to have asthma."
"Sucks to your asthma."
"When I saw Jack, I was sure he'd go for the conch. Can't think why."
The group of boys looked at the white shell with affectionate respect. Piggy placed it in Ralph's hands, and the little 'uns, seeing the familiar symbol, started to come back. "Not here." He turned towards the platform, feeling the need for ritual. First went Ralph, the white conch cradled, then Piggy, very grave, then the twins, then the little uns and the others. "Sit down, all of you. They raided us for fire. They're having fun, but the—" Ralph was puzzled by the shudder that flickered in his brain. There was something he wanted to say, then the shutter had come down. But they were regarding him gravely, not yet troubled by any doubts about his sufficiency. Ralph pushed the idiot hair out of his eyes and looked at Piggy. "But the fire, of course, the fire." He started to laugh, then stopped, and became fluent instead. "The fire's the most important thing. Without the fire we can't be rescued. I'd like to put on war paint and be a savage, but we must keep the fire burning. The fire's the most important thing on the island, because... He paused again, and the silence became full of doubt and wonder. Piggy whispered urgently, "Rescue!" "Oh, yes. Without the fire we can't be rescued. So we must stay by the fire and make smoke." When he stopped, no one said anything. After the many brilliant speeches that had been made on this very spot, Ralph's remarks seemed lame, even to the little 'uns. At last Bill held out his hands for the conch. "Now we can't have the fire up there. Because we can't have the fire up there, we need more people to keep it going. Let's go to this feast and tell them the fire's hard on the rest of us. And then hunting and all that, being savages, I mean, must be jolly good fun." Sam Nerrick took the conch. "That must be fun, like Bill says. And as he's invited us to a feast, meat, crackling. Oh, I could do with some meat." Ralph held up his hand. "Why shouldn't we get our own meat?" The twins looked at each other. Bill answered, "We don't want to go in the jungle." Ralph grimaced. "He, goes. He's a hunter. They're all hunters. That's different." No one spoke for a moment. Then Piggy muttered to the sand, "Meat." The little 'uns sat solemnly thinking of meat and dribbling. Overhead the cannon boomed again, and the dry palm fronds clattered in a sudden gust of hot wind. "You are a silly little boy," said the Lord of the Flies. "Just an ignorant, silly little boy." Simon moved his swollen tongue, but said nothing. "Don't you agree?" said the Lord of the Flies. "Aren't you just a silly little boy?" Simon answered him in the same silent voice. "Well then," said the Lord of the Flies, "you'd better run off and play with the others. They think you're batty. You don't want Ralph to think you're batty, do you? You like Ralph a lot, don't you? And Piggy? And Jack?" Simon's head was tilted slightly up. His eyes could not break away, and the Lord of the Flies hung in space before him. "What are you doing out here all alone? Aren't you afraid of me?" Simon shook. "There isn't anyone to help you. Only me. And I'm the beast." Simon's mouth laboured, brought forth audible words. "Pig's head on a stick." "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill," said the head. For a moment or two the forest, and all the other dimly appreciated places, echoed with the parody of laughter. "You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you? Close, close, close. I'm the reason why it's no go, why things are what they are." The laughter shivered again. "Come now," said the Lord of the Flies. "Get back to the others, and we'll forget the whole thing." Simon's head wobbled. His eyes were half closed, as though he were imitating the obscene thing on the stick. He knew that one of his times was coming on. The Lord of the Flies was expanding like a balloon. "This is ridiculous. You know perfectly well you'll only meet me down there, so don't try to escape." Simon's body was arched and stiff. The Lord of the Flies spoke in the voice of a schoolmaster. "This has gone quite far enough. My poor misguided child, do you think you know better than I do?" There was a pause. "I'm warning you. I'm going to get waxy. Do you see? You're not wanted. Understand? We are going to have fun on this island, understand? We are going to have fun on this island, so don't try it on, my poor misguided boy, or else." Simon found he was looking into a vast mouth. There was blackness within, a blackness that spread. "Or else," said the Lord of the Flies, "we shall do you. See? Jack and Roger and Morris and Robert and Bill and Piggy and Ralph. Do you? See?" Simon was inside the mouth. He fell down and lost consciousness. Chapter 9. A View to a Death. Over the island the build-up of clouds continued. A steady current of heated air rose all day from the mountain, and was thrust to 10,000 feet. Revolving masses of gas piled up the static until the air was ready to explode. By early evening the sun had gone, and a brassy glare had taken the place of clear daylight. Even the air that pushed in from the sea was hot, and held no refreshment. Colours drained from water, and trees, and pink surfaces of rock, and the white and brown clouds brooded. Nothing prospered but the flies, who blackened their lord, and made the spilt guts look like a heap of glistening coal. Even when the vessel broke in Simon's nose, and the blood gushed out, they left him alone, preferring the pig's high flavour. With the running of blood, Simon's fit passed into the weariness of sleep. He lay in the mat of creepers while the evening advanced, and the cannon continued to play. At last he woke, and saw dimly the dark earth close by his cheek. Still he did not move, but lay there, his face sideways on the earth, his eyes looking dully before him. Then he turned over, drew his feet under him, and laid hold of the creepers to pull himself up. When the creepers shook, the flies exploded from the guts with a vicious note and clamped back on again. Simon got to his feet. The light was unearthly. The Lord of the Flies hung on his stick like a black ball. Simon spoke aloud to the clearing. "What else is there to do?" Nothing replied. Simon turned away from the open space and crawled through the creepers till he was in the dusk of the forest. He walked drearily between the trunks, his face empty of expression, and the blood was dry round his mouth and chin. Only sometimes, as he lifted the ropes of creeper aside and chose his direction from the trend of the land, he mouthed words that did not reach the air. Presently the creepers festooned the trees less frequently, and there was a scatter of pearly light from the sky down through the trees. This was the backbone of the island, the slightly higher land that lay beneath the mountain, where the forest was no longer deep jungle. Here there were wide spaces interspersed with thickets and huge trees, and the trend of the ground led him up as the forest opened. He pushed on, staggering sometimes with his weariness, but never stopping. The usual brightness was gone from his eyes, and he walked with a sort of glum determination, like an old man. A buffet of wind made him stagger, and he saw that he was out in the open, on rock, under a brassy sky. He found his legs were weak, and his tongue gave him pain all the time. When the wind reached the mountain top, he could see something happen, a flicker of blue stuff against brown clouds. He pushed himself forward, and the wind came again, stronger now, cuffing the forest heads till they ducked and roared. Simon saw a humped thing suddenly sit up on the top and look down at him. He hid his face and toiled on. The flies had found the figure, too. The lifelike movement would scare them off for a moment, so that they made a dark cloud round the head. Then, as the blue material of the parachute collapsed, the corpulent figure would bow forward, sighing, and the flies settle once more. Simon felt his knees smack the rock. He crawled forward, and soon he understood. The tangle of lines showed him the mechanics of this parody. He examined the white nasal bones, the teeth, the colours of corruption. He saw how pitilessly the layers of rubber and canvas held together the poor body that should be rotting away. Then the wind blew again, and the figure lifted, bowed, and breathed foully at him. Simon knelt on all fours and was sick till his stomach was empty. Then he took the lines in his hands. He freed them from the rocks, and the figure from the wind's indignity. At last he turned away and looked down at the beaches. The fire by the platform appeared to be out, or at least making no smoke. Further along the beach, beyond the little river, and near a great slab of rock, a thin trickle of smoke was climbing into the sky. Simon, forgetful of the flies, shaded his eyes with both hands and peered at the smoke. Even at that distance it was possible to see that most of the boys, perhaps all the boys, were there. So they had shifted camp then, away from the beast. As Simon thought this, he turned to the poor broken thing that sat stinking by his side. The beast was harmless and horrible, and the news must reach the others as soon as possible. He started down the mountain, and his legs gave beneath him. Even with great care, the best he could do was a stagger. "Bathing," said Ralph. "That's the only thing to do." Piggy was inspecting the looming sky through his glass.
"I don't like the clouds. Remember how it rained just after we landed?"
"Going to rain again." Ralph dived into the pool. A couple of little uns were playing at the edge, trying to extract comfort from a wetness warmer than blood. Piggy took off his glasses, stepped primly into the water, and then put them on again. Ralph came to the surface and squirted a jet of water at him.
"Mind my specs," said Piggy. "If I get water on the glass, I got to get out and clean 'em."
Ralph squirted again and missed. He laughed at Piggy, expecting him to retire meekly, as usual, and in pained silence. Instead, Piggy beat the water with his hands.
"Stop it!" he shouted. "D'yer hear?"
Furiously, he drove the water into Ralph's face. All right," said Ralph. "Keep your hair on." Piggy stopped beating the water.
"I got a pain in my head. I wish the air was cooler."
"I wish the rain would come."
"I wish we could go home."
Piggy lay back against the sloping sand side of the pool. His stomach protruded, and the water dried on it. Ralph squirted up at the sky. One could guess at the movement of the sun by the progress of a light patch among the clouds. He knelt in the water and looked round. "Where's everybody?" Piggy sat up.
"Perhaps they're lying in the shelter."
"Where's Sam Nerrick? And Bill?" Piggy pointed beyond the platform.
"That's where they've gone. Jack's party."
"Let them go," said Ralph uneasily. "I don't care."
"Just for some meat."
"And for hunting," said Ralph wisely. "And for pretending to be a tribe and putting on war paint." Piggy stirred the sand under water and did not look at Ralph.
"Perhaps we ought to go too."
Ralph looked at him quickly, and Piggy blushed.
"I mean, to make sure nothing happens."
Ralph squirted water again. Long before Ralph and Piggy came up with Jack's lot, they could hear the party. There was a stretch of grass in a place where the palms left a wide band of turf between the forest and the shore. Just one step down from the edge of the turf was the white, blown sand of above high water, warm, dry, trodden. Below that again was a rock that stretched away towards the lagoon. Beyond was a short stretch of sand, and then the edge of the water. A fire burned on a rock, and fat dripped from the roasting pig meat into the invisible flames. All the boys of the island, except Piggy, Ralph, Simon, and the two tending the pig, were grouped on the turf. They were laughing, singing, lying, squatting, or standing on the grass, holding food in their hands. But to judge by the greasy faces, the meat-eating was almost done, and some held coconut shells in their hands and were drinking from them. Before the party had started, a great log had been dragged into the centre of the lawn, and Jack, painted and garlanded, sat there like an idol. There were piles of meat on green leaves near him, and fruit, and coconut shells full of drink. Piggy and Ralph came to the edge of the grassy platform, and the boys, as they noticed them, fell silent one by one, till only the boy next to Jack was talking. Then the silence intruded even there, and Jack turned where he sat. For a time he looked at them, and the crackle of the fire was the loudest noise over the bourdon of the reef. Ralph looked away, and Sam, thinking that Ralph had turned to him accusingly, put down his gnawed bone with a nervous giggle. Ralph took an uncertain step, pointed to a palm tree, and whispered something inaudible to Piggy, and they both giggled like Sam. Lifting his feet high out of the sand, Ralph started to stroll past. Piggy tried to whistle. At this moment the boys who were cooking at the fire suddenly hauled off a great chunk of meat and ran with it towards the grass. They bumped Piggy, who was burnt, and yelled and danced. Immediately, Ralph and the crowd of boys were united and relieved by a storm of laughter. Piggy once more was the centre of social derision, so that everyone felt cheerful and normal. Jack stood up and waved his spear.
"Take them some meat."
The boys with the spit gave Ralph and Piggy each a succulent chunk. They took the gift, dribbling. So they stood and ate beneath a sky of thunderous brass that rang with the storm coming. Jack waved his spear again.
"Has everybody eaten as much as they want?"
There was still food left, sizzling on the wooden spits, heaped on the green platters. Betrayed by his stomach, Piggy threw a picked bone down on the beach, and stooped for more. Jack spoke again, impatiently.
"Has everybody eaten as much as they want?"
His tone conveyed a warning, given out of the pride of ownership, and the boys ate faster while there was still time. Seeing there was no immediate likelihood of pause, Jack rose from the log that was his throne and sauntered to the edge of the grass. He looked down from behind his paint at Ralph and Piggy. They moved a little further off over the sand, and Ralph watched the fire as he ate. He noticed, without understanding, how the flames were visible now against the dull light. Evening was come, not with calm beauty, but with the threat of violence. Jack spoke.
"Give me a drink."
Henry brought him a shell, and he drank, watching Piggy and Ralph over the jagged rim. Power lay in the brown swell of his forearms. Authority sat on his shoulder and chattered in his ear like an ape.
"All sit down."
The boys ranged themselves in rows on the grass before him, but Ralph and Piggy stayed a foot lower, standing on the soft sand. Jack ignored them for a moment, turned his mask down to the seated boys, and pointed at them with the spear.
"Who is going to join my tribe?"
Ralph made a sudden movement that became a stumble. Some of the boys turned towards him.
"I gave you food," said Jack, "and my hunters will protect you from the beast. Who will join my tribe?"
"I'm chief," said Ralph, "because you chose me, and we were going to keep the fire going. Now you run after food."
"You ran yourself," shouted Jack. "Look at that bone in your hands."
Ralph went crimson. "I said you were hunters. That was your job." Jack ignored him again.
"Who'll join my tribe and have fun?"
"I'm chief," said Ralph tremulously. "And what about the fire? And I've got the conch."
"You haven't got it with you," said Jack, sneering. "You left it behind. See? Clever. And the conch doesn't count at this end of the island."
All at once the thunder struck. Instead of the dull boom, there was a point of impact in the explosion. "The conch counts here too," said Ralph, "and all over the island."
"What are you going to do about it, then?"
Ralph examined the ranks of boys. There was no help in them, and he looked away, confused and sweating. Piggy whispered, "The fire! Rescue!"
"Who'll join my tribe?"
"I will. Me. I will. I'll blow the conch," said Ralph breathlessly, "and call an assembly."
"We shan't hear it."
Piggy touched Ralph's wrist. "Come away. There's going to be trouble. And we've had our meat." There was a blink of bright light beyond the forest, and the thunder exploded again so that a little one started to whine. Big drops of rain fell among them, making individual sounds when they struck. "Going to be a storm," said Ralph, "and you'll have rain like when we dropped here. Who's clever now? Where are your shelters? What are you going to do about that?" The hunters were looking uneasily at the sky, flinching from the stroke of the drops. A wave of restlessness set the boys swaying and moving aimlessly. The flickering light became brighter, and the blows of the thunder were only just bearable. The little uns began to run about, screaming. Jack leapt onto the sand.
"Do our dance! Come on, dance!"
He ran, stumbling through the thick sand, to the open space of rock beyond the fire. Between the flashes of lightning the air was dark and terrible, and the boys followed him clamorously. Roger became the pig, grunting and charging at Jack, who sidestepped. The hunters took their spears, the cooks took spits, and the rest clubs of firewood. While Roger mimed the terror of the pig, the little uns ran and jumped on the outside of the circle. Piggy and Ralph, under the threat of the sky, found themselves eager to take a place in this demented but partly secure society. They were glad to touch the brown backs of the fence that hemmed in the terror, and made it governable.
"Kill the beast! Cut his throat! Spill his blood!"
The movement became regular, while the chant lost its first superficial excitement, and began to beat like a steady pulse. Roger ceased to be a pig and became a hunter, so that the centre of the ring yawned emptily. Some of the little uns started a ring on their own, and the complementary circles went round and round, as though repetition would achieve safety of itself. There was the throb and stamp of a single organism. The dark sky was shattered by a blue-white scar. An instant later, the noise was on them like the blow of a gigantic whip. The chant rose a tone in agony.
"Kill the beast! Cut his throat! Spill his blood!"
Now, out of the terror, rose another desire, thick, urgent, blind.
"Kill the beast! Cut his throat! Spill his blood!"
Again the blue-white scar jagged above them, and the sulphurous explosion beat down. The little uns screamed and blundered about, fleeing from the edge of the forest, and one of them broke the ring of big uns in his terror. "Him! Him!" The circle became a horseshoe. A thing was crawling out of the forest. It came darkly, uncertainly. The shrill screaming that rose before the beast was like a pain. The beast stumbled into the horseshoe.
"Kill the beast! Cut his throat! Spill his blood!"
The blue-white scar was constant, the noise unendurable. Simon was crying out something about a dead man on a hill.
"Kill the beast! Cut his throat! Spill his blood! Do him in!"
The sticks fell, and the mouth of the new circle crunched and screamed. The beast was on its knees in the centre, its arms folded over its face. It was crying out against the abominable noise, something about a body on the hill. The beast struggled forward, broke the ring, and fell over the steep edge of the rock to the sand by the water. At once the crowd surged after it, poured down the rock, leapt onto the beast, screamed, struck, bit, tore. There were no words and no movements, but the tearing of teeth and claws. Then the clouds opened, and let down the rain like a waterfall. The water bounded from the mountain-top, tore leaves and branches from the trees, poured like a cold shower over the struggling heap on the sand. Presently the heap broke up, and figures staggered away. Only the beast lay still, a few yards from the sea. Even in the rain they could see how small a beast it was, and already its blood was staining the sand. Now a great wind blew the rain sideways, cascading the water from the forest trees. On the mountain-top, the parachute filled and moved. The figure slid, rose to its feet, spun, swayed down through a vastness of wet air, and trod with ungainly feet the tops of the high trees. Falling, still falling, it sank towards the beach, and the boys rushed screaming into the darkness. The parachute took the figure forward, furrowing the lagoon, and bumped it over the reef and out to sea. Towards midnight the rain ceased, and the clouds drifted away so that the sky was scattered once more with the incredible lamps of stars. Then the breeze died too, and there was no noise save the drip and trickle of water that ran out of clefts and spilled down leaf by leaf to the brown earth of the island. The air was cool, moist and clear, and presently even the sound of the water was still. The beast lay huddled on the pale beach, and the stains spread, inch by inch. The edge of the lagoon became a streak of phosphorescence, which advanced minutely as the great wave of the tide flowed. The clear water mirrored the clear sky and the angular, bright constellations. The line of phosphorescence bulged about the sand grains and the little pebbles. It held them each in a dimple of tension, then suddenly accepted them with an inaudible syllable, and moved on. Along the shoreward edge of the shallows, the advancing clearness was full of strange moonbeam-bodied creatures with fiery eyes. Here and there a larger pebble clung to its own air and was covered with a coat of pearls. The tide swelled in over the rain-pitted sand and smoothed everything with a layer of silver. Now it touched the first of the stains that seeped from the broken body, and the creatures made a moving patch of light as they gathered at the edge. The water rose further, and dressed Simon's coarse hair with brightness. The line of his cheek silvered, and the turn of his shoulder became sculptured marble. The strange attendant creatures, with their fiery eyes and trailing vapours, busied themselves round his head. The body lifted a fraction of an inch from the sand, and a bubble of air escaped from the mouth with a wet plop. Then it turned gently in the water. Somewhere, over the darkened curve of the world, the sun and moon were pulling, and the film of water on the Earth planet was held, bulging slightly on one side, while the solid core turned. The great wave of the tide moved further along the island, and the water lifted. Softly, surrounded by a fringe of inquisitive, bright creatures, itself a silver shape beneath the steadfast constellations, Simon's dead body moved out towards the open sea. Chapter 10. The Shell and the Glasses. Piggy eyed the advancing figure carefully. Nowadays he sometimes found that he saw more clearly if he removed his glasses and shifted the one lens to the other eye. But even through the good eye, after what had happened, Ralph remained unmistakably Ralph. He came now out of the coconut trees, limping, dirty, with dead leaves hanging from his shock of yellow hair. One eye was a slit in his puffy cheek, and a great scab had formed on his right knee. He paused for a moment and peered at the figure on the platform. "Piggy, are you the only one left?"
"There's some little uns."
"They don't count. No big uns."
"Oh, Sam Nerrick. They're collecting wood."
"Nobody else?"
"Not that I know of."
Ralph climbed onto the platform carefully. The coarse grass was still worn away where the assembly used to sit. The fragile white conch still gleamed by the polished seat. Ralph sat down in the grass facing the chief's seat and the conch. Piggy knelt at his left, and for a long minute there was silence. At last Ralph cleared his throat and whispered something. Piggy whispered back.
"What did you say?"
Ralph spoke up. "Simon." Piggy said nothing, but nodded solemnly. They continued to sit, gazing with impaired sight at the chief's seat and the glittering lagoon. The green light and the glossy patches of sunshine played over their befouled bodies. At length Ralph got up and went to the conch. He took the shell caressingly with both hands, and knelt, leaning against the trunk. "Piggy."
"Hmm?"
"What are we going to do?" Piggy nodded at the conch.
"You could
"Call an assembly." Ralph laughed sharply as he said the word, and Piggy frowned.
"You're still chief."
Ralph laughed again.
"No, you are, over us."
"I got the conch."
"Ralph, stop laughing like that. Look, there ain't no need, Ralph. What's the others going to think?"
At last Ralph stopped. He was shivering. "Piggy."
"Hmm?"
"That was Simon."
"You said that before."
"Piggy."
"Hmm?"
"That was murder."
"You stop it," said Piggy shrilly. "What good are you doing talking like that?"
He jumped to his feet and stood over Ralph.
"It was dark. There was that bloody dance. There was lightning and thunder and rain. We were scared."
"I wasn't scared," said Ralph slowly. "I don't know what I was."
"We were scared," said Piggy excitedly. "Anything might have happened. It wasn't what you said."
He was gesticulating, searching for a formula. "Oh, Piggy." Ralph's voice, low and stricken, stopped Piggy's gestures. He bent down and waited. Ralph, cradling the conch, rocked himself to and fro. "Don't you understand, Piggy? The things we did—"
"He may still be—"
"No."
"Perhaps he was only pretending."
Piggy's voice tailed off at the sight of Ralph's face. "You were outside? Outside the circle. You never really came in. Didn't you see what they did?" There was loathing, and at the same time a kind of feverish excitement in his voice. "Didn't you see, Piggy?"
"Not all that well. I only got one eye now. You ought to know that, Ralph."
Ralph continued to rock to and fro.
"It was an accident," said Piggy suddenly. "That's what it was. An accident."
His voice shrilled again.
"Coming in the dark. He had no business crawling like that out of the dark. He was batty. He asked for it."
He gesticulated widely again.
"It was an accident."
"You didn't see what they did."
"Look, Ralph, we got to forget this. We can't do no good thinking about it, see?"
"I'm frightened of us. I want to go home. Oh, God, I want to go home."
"It was an accident,"
said Piggy stubbornly.
"and that's that."
He touched Ralph's bare shoulder, and Ralph shuddered at the human contact.
"And look, Ralph."
Piggy glanced round quickly, then leaned close.
"Don't let on we was in that dance. Not to Sam Nerrick."
"But we were. All of us." Piggy shook his head.
"Not us till last. They never noticed in the dark. Anyway, you said I was only on the outside."
"So was I," muttered Ralph. "I was on the outside, too." Piggy nodded eagerly.
"That's right, we was on the outside. We never done nothing. We never seen nothing."
Piggy paused, then went on.
"We'll live on our own, the four of us."
"4 of us? We aren't enough to keep the fire burning."
"We'll try. See? I lit it."
Sam Nerrick came dragging a great log out of the forest. They dumped it by the fire and turned to the pool. Ralph jumped to his feet. "Hi, you two." The twins checked for a moment, then walked on.
"They're going to bathe, Ralph."
"Better get it over." The twins were very surprised to see Ralph. They flushed and looked past him into the air.
"Hello. Fancy meeting you, Ralph. We just been in the forest to get wood for the fire. We got lost last night."
Ralph examined his toes. "You got lost after the—" Piggy cleaned his lens. "After the feast," said Sam in a stifled voice. Eric nodded. "Yes, after the feast."
"We left early," said Piggy quickly, "because we were tired."
"So did we, very early. We were very tired." Sam touched a scratch on his forehead, and then hurriedly took his hand away. Eric fingered his split lip. "Yes, we were very tired," repeated Sam, "so we left early." "Was it a good The air was heavy with unspoken knowledge. Sam twisted, and the obscene word shot out of him. Dance? Memory of the dance that none of them had attended shook all four boys convulsively. We left early. When Roger came to the neck of land that joined the Castle Rock to the mainland, he was not surprised to be challenged. He had reckoned during the terrible night on finding at least some of the tribe holding out against the horrors of the island in the safest place. The voice rang out sharply from on high, where the diminishing crags were balanced one on another.
"Halt! Who goes there?"
"Roger."
"Advance, friend."
Roger advanced.
"You can see who I was. The chief said we've got to challenge everyone."
Roger peered up.
"You couldn't stop me coming if I wanted." "Couldn't I? Climb up and see."
Roger clambered up the ladder-like cliff.
"Look at this."
A log had been jammed under the topmost rock, and another lever under that. Robert leaned slightly on the lever, and the rock groaned. A full effort would send the rock thundering down to the neck of land. Roger admired.
"He's a proper chief, isn't he?"
Robert nodded. "He's going to take us hunting." He jerked his head in the direction of the distant shelters, where a thread of white smoke climbed up the sky. Roger, sitting on the very edge of the cliff, looked somberly back at the island as he worked with his fingers at a loose tooth. His gaze settled on the top of the distant mountain, and Robert changed the unspoken subject.
"He's going to beat Wilfred."
"What for?" Robert shook his head doubtfully. "I don't know. He didn't say. He got angry and made us tie Wilfred up. He giggled excitedly. "He's been tied for hours, waiting."
"But didn't the chief say why?"
"I never heard him." Sitting on the tremendous rocks in the torrid sun, Roger received this news as an illumination. He ceased to work at his tooth and sat still, assimilating the possibilities of irresponsible authority. Then, without another word, he climbed down the back of the rocks towards the cave and the rest of the tribe. The chief was sitting there, naked to the waist, his face blocked out in white and red. The tribe lay in a semicircle before him. The newly beaten and untied Wilfred was sniffing noisily in the background. Roger squatted with the rest.
"Tomorrow," went on the chief, "we shall hunt again."
He pointed at this savage and that with his spear.
"Some of you will stay here to improve the cave and defend the gate. I shall take a few hunters with me and bring back meat. The defenders of the gate will see that the others don't sneak in."
A savage raised his hand, and the chief turned a bleak, painted face towards him.
"Why should they try to sneak in, chief?"
The chief was vague but earnest.
"They will. They'll try to spoil things we do. So the watchers at the gate must be careful. And then—"
The chief paused. They saw a triangle of startling pink dart out, pass along his lips, and vanish again.
"And then the beast might try to come in. You remember how he crawled?"
The semicircle shuddered and muttered in agreement.
"He came disguised. He may come again, even though we gave him the head of our kill to eat. So watch and be careful."
Stanley lifted his forearm off the rock and held up an interrogative finger.
"Well, but didn't we—"
He squirmed and looked down.
"No."
In the silence that followed, each savage flinched away from his individual memory.
"No. How could we kill it?"
Half relieved, half daunted by the implication of further terrors, the savages murmured again.
"So leave the mountain alone," said the chief solemnly, "and give it the head if you go hunting."
Stanley flicked his finger again.
"I expect the beast disguised itself."
"Perhaps," said the chief. A theological speculation presented itself.
"We'd better keep on the right side of him anyhow." You can't tell what he might do."
The tribe considered this, and then was shaken as if by a flow of wind. The chief saw the effect of his words and stood abruptly.
"But tomorrow we'll hunt, and when we've got meat we'll have a feast."
Bill put up his hand.
"Chief." "Yes?" "What do we use for lighting the fire?"
The chief's blush was hidden by the white and red clay. Into his uncertain silence the tribe spilled their murmur once more. Then the chief held up his hand.
"We shall take fire from the others. Tomorrow we'll hunt and get meat. Tonight I'll go along with 2 hunters. Who'll come?"
Morris and Roger put up their hands.
"Morris?"
"Yes, Chief."
"Where was their fire?"
"Back at the old place by the Fire Rock." The chief nodded.
"The rest of you can go to sleep as soon as the sun sets. But us 3, Morris, Roger and me, we've got work to do. We'll leave just before sunset."
Morris put up his hand.
"But what happens if we meet—"
The chief waved his objection aside.
"We'll keep along by the sand. Then if he comes, we'll do our dance again. Only the 3 of us."
Again the murmur swelled and died away. Piggy handed Ralph his glasses and waited to receive back his sight. The wood was damp, and this was the 3rd time they had lighted it. Ralph stood back, speaking to himself. "We don't want another night without fire." He looked round guiltily at the 3 boys standing by. This was the first time he had admitted the double function of the fire. Certainly one was to send up a beckoning column of smoke, but the other was to be a hearth now, and a comfort until they slept. Eric breathed on the wood till it glowed and sent out a little flame. A billow of white and yellow smoke reeked up. Piggy took back his glasses and looked at the smoke with pleasure.
"If only we could make a radio, or a plane, or a boat."
Ralph dredged in his fading knowledge of the world.
"We might get taken prisoner by the Reds."
Eric pushed back his hair. "They'd be better than—" He would not name people, and Sam finished the sentence for him by nodding along the beach. Ralph remembered the ungainly figure on a parachute. He said something about a dead man. He flushed painfully at this admission that he had been present at the dance. He made urging motions at the smoke with his body. "Don't stop. Go on up."
"Smoke's getting thinner."
"We need more wood already, even when it's wet."
"My asthma!"
The response was mechanical. "Sucks to your asthma."
"If I pull logs about, I get my asthma bad. I wish I didn't, Ralph, but there it is."
The 3 boys went into the forest and fetched armfuls of rotten wood. Once more the smoke rose, yellow and thick. "Let's get something to eat." Together they went to the fruit trees, carrying their spears, saying little, cramming in haste. When they came out of the forest again, the sun was setting, and only embers glowed in the fire, and there was no smoke.
"I can't carry any more wood," said Eric. "I'm tired."
Ralph cleared his throat. "We kept the fire going up there."
"Up there it was small, but this has got to be a big one."
Ralph carried a fragment to the fire and watched the smoke that drifted into the dusk. "We've got to keep it going." Eric flung himself down.
"I'm too tired. And what's the good?"
"Eric!" cried Ralph in a shocked voice. "Don't talk like that." Sam knelt by Eric.
"Well, what is the good?"
Ralph tried indignantly to remember. There was something good about a fire, something overwhelmingly good.
"Ralph's told you often enough," said Piggy moodily. "How else are we going to be rescued?"
"Of course. If we don't make smoke—" He squatted before them in the crowding dusk. "Don't you understand? What's the good of wishing for radios and boats?" He held out his hand and twisted the fingers into a fist. "There's only one thing we can do to get out of this mess. Anyone can play at hunting. Anyone can get us meat." He looked from face to face. Then, at the moment of greatest passion and conviction, that curtain flapped in his head, and he forgot what he had been driving at. He knelt there, his fist clenched, gazing solemnly from one to the other. Then the curtain whisked back. "Oh, yes. So we've got to make smoke, and more smoke. But we can't keep it going. Look at that!" The fire was dying on them. "Two to mind the fire," said Ralph, half to himself. "That's 12 hours a day. We can't get any more wood, Ralph. Not in the dark. Not at night."
"We can light it every morning," said Piggy. "Nobody ain't going to see smoke in the dark."
Sam nodded vigorously. It was different when the fire was up there. Ralph stood up, feeling curiously defenceless with the darkness pressing in. "Let the fire go, then, for tonight." He led the way to the first shelter, which still stood, though battered. The bed leaves lay within, dry and noisy to the touch. In the next shelter, a little un was talking in his sleep. The 4 big uns crept into the shelter and burrowed under the leaves. The twins lay together, and Ralph and Piggy at the other end. For a while there was the continual creak and rustle of leaves as they tried for comfort. "Piggy."
"Yeah?"
"All right?"
"S'pose so."
At length, save for an occasional rustle, the shelter was silent. An oblong of blackness, relieved with brilliant spangles, hung before them, and there was the hollow sound of surf on the reef. Ralph settled himself for his nightly game of supposing. Supposing they could be transported home by jet, then before morning they would land at that big airfield in Wiltshire. They would go by car. No, for things to be perfect, they would go by train, all the way down to Devon, and take that cottage again. Then at the foot of the garden the wild ponies would come and look over the wall. Ralph turned restlessly in the leaves. Dartmoor was wild, and so were the ponies, but the attraction of wildness had gone. His mind skated to a consideration of a tamed town where savagery could not set foot. What could be safer than the bus centre, with its lamps and wheels? All at once Ralph was dancing round a lamp standard. There was a bus crawling out of the bus station. A strange bus.
"Ralph! Ralph!"
"What is it?"
"Don't make a noise like that."
"Sorry." From the darkness at the further end of the shelter came a dreadful moaning, and they shattered the leaves in their fear. Sam and Eric, locked in an embrace, were fighting each other.
"Sam! Sam! Hey, Eric!"
Presently all was quiet again. Piggy spoke softly to Ralph.
"We got to get out of this."
"What do you mean?"
"Get rescued."
For the first time that day, and despite the crowding blackness, Ralph sniggered.
"I mean it,"
whispered Piggy.
"If we don't get home soon, we'll be balmy.
Round the bend.
Bomb-happy. Crackers."
Ralph pushed the damp tendrils of hair out of his eyes.
"You write a letter to your auntie."
Piggy considered this solemnly.
"I don't know where she is now, and I haven't got an envelope and a stamp, and there isn't a pillar box or a postman."
The success of his tiny joke overcame Ralph. His sniggers became uncontrollable. His body jumped and twitched. Piggy rebuked him with dignity.
"I haven't said anything all that funny."
Ralph continued to snigger, though his chest hurt. His twitchings exhausted him till he lay, breathless and woebegone, waiting for the next spasm. During one of these pauses, he was ambushed by sleep.
"Ralph, you've been making a noise again. Do be quiet, Ralph, because—"
Ralph heaved over among the leaves. He had reason to be thankful that his dream was broken, for the bus had been nearer and more distinct.
"Why, because—" "Be quiet and listen."
Ralph lay down carefully, to the accompaniment of a long sigh from the leaves. Eric moaned something, and then lay still. The darkness, save for the useless oblong of stars, was blanket thick. I can't hear anything.
There's something moving outside.
Ralph's head prickled. The sound of his blood drowned all else, and then subsided. I still can't hear anything.
Listen. Listen for a long time.
Quite clearly and emphatically, and only a yard or so away from the back of the shelter, a stick cracked. The blood roared again in Ralph's ears. Confused images chased each other through his mind. A composite of these things was prowling round the shelters. He could feel Piggy's head against his shoulder, and the convulsive grip of a hand.
"Ralph! Ralph! Shut up and listen."
Desperately Ralph prayed that the beast would prefer Littlelands. A voice whispered horribly outside.
"Piggy! Piggy! It's come!"
gasped Piggy.
"It's real!"
He clung to Ralph and reached to get his breath.
"Piggy! Come out the side! I want you, Piggy!"
Ralph's mouth was against Piggy's ear. "Don't say anything."
"Piggy! Where are you, Piggy?"
Something brushed against the back of the shelter. Piggy kept still for a moment. Then he had his asthma. He arched his back and crashed among the leaves with his legs. Ralph rolled away from him. Then there was a vicious snarling in the mouth of the shelter, and the plunge and thump of living things. Someone tripped over Ralph, and Piggy's corner became a complication of snarls and crashes and flying limbs. Ralph hit out. Then he and what seemed like a dozen others were rolling over and over, hitting, biting, scratching. He was torn and jolted, found fingers in his mouth and bit them. A fist withdrew and came back like a piston, so that the whole shelter exploded into light. Ralph twisted sideways on top of a writhing body and felt hot breath on his cheek. He began to pound the mouth below him, using his clenched fist as a hammer. He hit with more and more passionate hysteria as the face became slippery. A knee jerked up between his legs, and he fell sideways, busying himself with his pain, and the fight rolled over him. Then the shelter collapsed with smothering finality, and the anonymous shapes fought their way out and through. Dark figures drew themselves out of the wreckage and flitted away, till the screams of the Littlelands and Piggy's gasps were once more audible. Ralph called out in a quavering voice, "All you Littlelands, go to sleep. We've had a fight with the others. Now go to sleep." Sam Nerrick came close and peered at Ralph. "Are you two all right?" "I think so. I got busted." "So did I. How's Piggy?" They hauled Piggy clear of the wreckage and leaned him against a tree. The night was cool and purged of immediate terror. Piggy's breathing was a little easier. "Did you get hurt, Piggy?"
"Not much."
"That was Jack and his hunters," said Ralph bitterly.
"Why can't they leave us alone?"
"We gave them something to think about," said Sam. Honesty compelled him to go on. "At least you did. I got mixed up with myself in a corner." "I gave one of 'em what for," said Ralph. "I smashed him up all right. He won't want to come and fight us again in a hurry." "So did I," said Eric. "When I woke up, one was kicking me in the face. I got an awful bloody face, I think, Ralph. But I did him in the end." "What did you do?"
"I got my knee up," said Eric, with a simple pride, "and I hit him with it in the pills. You should have heard him holler. He won't come back in a hurry either. So we didn't do too badly."
Ralph moved suddenly in the dark. But then he heard Eric working at his mouth. "What's the matter?"
"Just a tooth loose."
Piggy drew up his legs. "You all right, Piggy?"
"I thought they wanted the conch."
Ralph trotted down the pale beach and jumped onto the platform. The conch still glimmered by the chief's seat. He gazed for a moment or two, then went back to Piggy. "They didn't take the conch."
"I know. They didn't come for the conch. They came for something else. Ralph, What am I going to do?"
Far off along the bow stave of beach, 3 figures trotted towards the castle rock. They kept away from the forest and down by the water. Occasionally they sang softly. Occasionally they turned cartwheels down by the moving streak of phosphorescence. The chief led them, trotting steadily, exulting in his achievement. He was a chief now, in truth, and he made stabbing motions with his spear. From his left hand dangled Piggy's broken glasses. End of Disc 5. Lord of the Flies, Disc 6. Chapter 11. Castle Rock. In the short chill of dawn, the 4 boys gathered round the black smudge where the fire had been, while Ralph knelt and blew. Grey, feathery ashes scurried hither and thither at his breath, but no spark shone among them. The twins watched anxiously, and Piggy sat expressionless behind the luminous wall of his myopia. Ralph continued to blow till his ears were singing with the effort, but then the first breeze of dawn took the job off his hands and blinded him with ashes. He squatted back, swore, and rubbed water out of his eyes. No use. Eric looked down at him through a mask of dried blood. Piggy peered in the general direction of Ralph.
"Course it's no use, Ralph. Now we got no fire."
Ralph brought his face within a couple of feet of Piggy's. "Can you see me?"
"A bit."
Ralph allowed the swollen flap of his cheek to close his eye again.
"They've got our fire!"
Rage shrilled in his voice.
"They stole it!" "That's them," said Piggy. "They blinded me, see? That's Jack married you. You call an assembly, Ralph. We've got to decide what to do."
"An assembly for only us?"
"It's all we got. Sam, let me hold on to you."
They went towards the platform.
"Blow the conch," said Piggy. "Blow as loud as you can."
The forest re-echoed, and birds lifted, crying out of the treetops, as on that first morning ages ago. Both ways the beach was deserted. Some little uns came from the shelters. Ralph sat down on the polished trunk, and the 3 others stood before him. He nodded, and Sam Nerick sat down on the right. Ralph pushed the conch into Piggy's hands. He held the shining thing carefully, and blinked at Ralph. "Go on, then."
"I just take the conch to say this. I can't see no more, and I got to get my glasses back. Awful things has been done on this island. I voted for you for chief. He's the only one who ever got anything done. So now you speak, Ralph, and tell us what you're else."
Piggy broke off, snivelling. Ralph took back the conch as he sat down. "Just an ordinary fire. You'd think we could do that, wouldn't you? Just a smoke signal so we can be rescued. Are we savages, or what? Only now there's no signal going up. Ships may be passing. Do you remember how he went hunting and the fire went out and a ship passed by? And they all think he's best as chief. Then there was... Well, that's his fault, too. If it hadn't been for him, it would never have happened. Now Piggy can't see. And they came, stealing—" Ralph's voice ran up, "at night, in darkness, and stole our fire. They stole it. We'd have given them fire if they'd asked, but they stole it, and the signal's out, and we can't ever be rescued. Don't you see what I mean? We'd have given them fire for themselves, only they stole it. He paused lamely as the curtain flickered in his brain. Piggy held out his hands for the conch.
"What are you going to do, Ralph? This is just talk without deciding. I want my glasses."
"I'm trying to think. Supposing we go looking like we used to, washed and hair-brushed. After all, we aren't savages, really. And being rescued isn't a game." He opened the flap of his cheek and looked at the twins. "We could smarten up a bit and then go." "We ought to take spears," said Sam.
even Piggy, because we may need them. You haven't got the conch. Piggy held up the shell. You can take spears if you want, but I shan't. What's the good? I'll have to be led like a dog anyhow. Yes, laugh, go on, laugh. There's them on this island as would laugh at anything. And what happened? What's grown-ups going to think? Young Simon was murdered, and there was that other kid what had a mark on his face. Who's seen him since we first come here? Piggy, stop a minute. I got the conch. I'm going to that Jack Merridew and tell him. I am. You'll get hurt. What can he do more than he has? I'll tell him what's what. You let me carry the conch, Ralph. I'll show him the one thing he hasn't got.
Piggy paused for a moment and peered round at the dim figures. The shape of the old assembly, trodden in the grass, listened to him.
I'm going to him with this conch in my hands. I'm going to hold it out. Look, I'm going to say, you're stronger than I am, and you haven't got asthma. You can see, I'm going to say, and with both eyes. But I don't ask for my glasses back, not as a favour. I don't ask you to be a sport, I'll say, not because you're strong, but because what's right's right. Give me my glasses, I'm going to say. You got to.
Piggy ended, flushed and trembling. He pushed the conch quickly into Ralph's hands, as though in a hurry to be rid of it, and wiped the tears from his eyes. The green light was gentle about them, and the conch lay at Ralph's feet fragile and white. A single drop of water that had escaped Piggy's fingers now flashed on the delicate curve, like a star. At last Ralph sat up straight, and drew back his hair. "All right. I mean, you can try if you like. We'll go with you." "He'll be painted," said Sam timidly. "You know how he'll be. He won't think much of us. If he gets waxy, we've had it." Ralph scowled at Sam. Dimly he remembered something that Simon had said to him once, by the rocks. "Don't be silly," he said, and then he added quickly, "Let's go." He held out the conch to Piggy, who flushed, this time with pride. "You must carry it." "When we're ready, I'll carry it." Piggy sought in his mind for words to convey his passionate willingness to carry the conch against all odds. "I don't mind. I'll be glad, Ralph. Only I'll have to be led." Ralph put the conch back on the shining log. "We better eat, and then get ready." They made their way to the devastated fruit trees. Piggy was helped to his food, and found some by touch. While they ate, Ralph thought of the afternoon. "We'll be like we were. We'll wash." Sam gulped down a mouthful and protested. "But we bathe every day." Ralph looked at the filthy objects before him and sighed. "We ought to comb our hair, only it's too long." "I've got both socks left in the shelter," said Eric, "so we could pull them over our heads like caps, sort of." "We could find some stuff," said Piggy, "and tie your hair back. Like a girl." "No, of course not." "Then we must go as we are," said Ralph, "and they won't be any better." Eric made a detaining gesture. "But they'll be painted. You know how it is." The others nodded. They understood only too well the liberation into savagery that the concealing paint brought. "Well, we won't be painted," said Ralph, "because we aren't savages." Sam and Eric looked at each other. All the same, Ralph shouted, "No paint!" He tried to remember. "Smoke," he said. "We want smoke." He turned on the twins fiercely. "I said, smoke! We've got to have smoke!" There was silence, except for the multitudinous murmur of the bees. At last Piggy spoke, kindly. "Course we have, 'cause the smoke's a signal, and we can't be rescued if we don't have smoke." "I knew that!" shouted Ralph. He pulled his arm away from Piggy. "Are you suggesting I'm just saying what you always say?" said Piggy hastily. "I thought for a moment—" "I hadn't," said Ralph loudly. "I knew all the time. I hadn't forgotten." Piggy nodded propitiatingly. "You're chief, Ralph.
You remember everything." "I hadn't forgotten." "Course not."
The twins were examining Ralph curiously, as though they were seeing him for the first time. They set off along the beach in formation. Ralph went first, limping a little, his spear carried over one shoulder. He saw things partially through the tremble of the heat haze over the flashing sands, and his own long hair and injuries. Behind him came the twins, worried now for a while, but full of unquenchable vitality. They said little, but trailed the butts of their wooden spears. For Piggy had found that, looking down, shielding his tired sight from the sun, he could just see these moving along the sand. He walked between the trailing butts, therefore, the conch held carefully between his two hands. The boys made a compact little group that moved over the beach, 4 plate-like shadows dancing and mingling beneath them. There was no sign left of the storm, and the beach was swept clean like a blade that has been scoured. The sky and the mountain were at an immense distance, shimmering in the heat, and the reef was lifted by mirage, floating in a kind of silver pool halfway up the sky. They passed the place where the tribe had danced. The charred sticks still lay on the rocks where the rain had quenched them, but the sand by the water was smooth again. They passed this in silence. No one doubted that the tribe would be found at Castle Rock, and when they came in sight of it they stopped with one accord. The densest tangle on the island, a mass of twisted stems, black and green and impenetrable, lay on their left, and tall grass swayed before them. Now Ralph went forward. Here was the crushed grass where they had all lain when he had gone to prospect. There was the neck of land, the ledge skirting the rock. Up there were the red pinnacles. Sam touched his arm. Smoke. There was a tiny smudge of smoke wavering into the air on the other side of the rock. Some fire, I don't think. Ralph turned. What are we hiding for? He stepped through the screen of grass onto the little open space that led to the narrow neck. You two follow behind. I'll go first, then Piggy a pace behind me. Keep your spears ready. Piggy peered anxiously into the luminous veil that hung between him and the world. Is it safe? Ain't no cliff? I can hear the sea. You keep right close to me. Ralph moved forward onto the neck. He kicked a stone, and it bounded into the water. Then the sea sucked down, revealing a red, weedy square 40 feet beneath Ralph's left arm. Am I safe? Quavered Piggy. I feel awful. High above them, from the pinnacles, came a sudden shout, and then an imitation war cry that was answered by a dozen voices from behind the rock. Give me the conch, and stay still. Halt! Who goes there? Ralph bent back his head and glimpsed Roger's dark face at the top. You can see who I am, he shouted. Stop being silly. He put the conch to his lips and began to blow. Savages appeared, painted out of recognition, edging round the ledge towards the neck. They carried spears and disposed themselves to defend the entrance. Ralph went on blowing and ignored Piggy's terrors. Roger was shouting, You mind out, see? At length Ralph took his lips away and paused to get his breath back. His first words were a gasp, but audible. Calling an assembly. The savages guarding the neck muttered among themselves, but made no motion. Ralph walked forward a couple of steps. A voice whispered urgently behind him, Don't leave me, Ralph. You kneel down, said Ralph sideways, and wait till I come back. He stood halfway along the neck and gazed at the savages intently. Freed by the paint, they had tied their hair back and were more comfortable than he was. Ralph made a resolution to tie his own back afterwards. Indeed, he felt like telling them to wait and doing it there and then, but that was impossible. The savages sniggered a bit, and one gestured at Ralph with his spear. High above, Roger took his hands off the lever and leaned out to see what was going on. The boys on the neck stood in a pool of their own shadow, diminished to shaggy heads. Piggy crouched, his back shapeless as a sack.
"I'm calling an assembly."
Silence. Roger took up a small stone and flung it between the twins, aiming to miss. They started, and Sam only just kept his footing. Some source of power began to pulse in Roger's body. Ralph spoke again, loudly.
"I'm calling an assembly."